They were once the most famous children in Hollywood. 6 kids, 2 of the biggest movie stars on the planet, and a family that seemed to represent everything glamorous about Hollywood. Maddox, Pax, Zahara, Shiloh, Knox, and Vivienne. They grew up surrounded by private jets, red carpets, cameras, enormous houses, and a level of attention most people could never imagine. But behind the photographs, their childhood was unfolding inside one of Hollywood's most complicated families. Their parents were Brad, Pitt and Angelina Jolie. And for years, the world watched them grow. People wanted to know what they would become. Would they become actors, directors, artists? Would they follow their parents into Hollywood? Or would they run as far away from the spotlight as possible? Then, everything changed. The marriage that had once seemed almost untouchable came to an end. The family entered years of legal battles, headlines, rumors, and intense public scrutiny. And while the world argued about Brad and Angelina, their children were growing up, quietly, away from the cameras whenever they could. One by one, they began developing identities of their own. Different interests, different personalities, different relationships with the Hollywood world they had inherited. And now, the children who were once photographed holding their parents' hands are no longer children. They are adults. And that changes everything. Because the real story isn't simply what happened between Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. The real story is what happened to the 6 people who had to grow up inside it. What did Hollywood's most famous family look like from the children's perspective? How did growing up with 2 superstar parents shape their lives? And after years of living under the shadow of Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, who are they becoming now? This is the untold story of Brad Pitt's children. And what happened after they grew up? Before they became adults. Before the headlines. Before the family became one of the most complicated stories in Hollywood. They were simply 6 children growing up together. Maddox, Pax, Zahara, Shiloh, Knox, and Vivienne. Each one arrived into the Jolie Pitt family through a different story. Some were adopted. Some were born into it. But all 6 would eventually share something very few children in the world could understand. Their parents were among the most recognizable people on Earth. Brad Pitt was already one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Angelina Jolie was an internationally famous actress and humanitarian. And together, they created a family that attracted extraordinary attention. Every family outing could become a photograph. Every public appearance could become a headline. Even ordinary childhood moments could become international news. For the children, however, this was simply normal life. Maddox was the first. Angelina adopted him from Cambodia in 2002. Before her relationship with Brad Pitt began. He was still very young when he entered Angelina's life. But Maddox would eventually become the oldest child in the family. And that position carried its own significance. He was simply growing up with famous parents. He was growing up as the older brother of 5 younger siblings. Then came Zahara. Angelina adopted her from Ethiopia in 2005. Zahara joined a family that was rapidly expanding. And soon, the Jolie Pitt household was becoming something much larger than the typical Hollywood family. Then came Shiloh. Born in Namibia in 2006, Shiloh became the first biological child of Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. Her birth immediately attracted enormous international attention. Photographs of the newborn reportedly became some of the most sought-after celebrity images in the world. But behind all that attention, she was still just a baby. And that distinction is important, because the world often saw the Jolie Pitt children as part of a celebrity story. Their parents were movie stars. Their family was famous. Their photographs were valuable. But the children themselves didn't choose any of that. They were simply born into it. Then came Pax. Angelina adopted him from Vietnam in 2007. And once again, the family grew. By this point, the Jolie Pitt children were becoming a recognizable group. Whenever they appeared in public, cameras followed. But Brad and Angelina repeatedly emphasized the importance of giving their children experiences outside the Hollywood bubble. The family traveled. They spent time in different countries. They were exposed to different cultures, different languages, different environments. For children growing up with enormous privilege, those experiences could offer something important. Perspective. Then in 2008, twins Knox and Vivienne were born in France. Suddenly, there were 6 children, and the Jolie Pitt family had become one of the most famous families in the world. Photographers waited outside airports. Fans followed their movements. Magazines published stories about their clothes, schools, vacations, and personalities. Even their names became recognizable across the globe. But fame has a strange effect on childhood. Most children get to grow up before the world decides who they are. The Jolie Pitt children didn't have that luxury. The world was watching them from the beginning. People speculated about what they would look like, what careers they would choose, which parent they resembled, whether they would become actors, whether they would inherit their parents' fame. And as the years passed, those questions became more complicated, because their children were growing up. And eventually, they would have to decide for themselves what their relationship with Hollywood would be. Would they embrace the world their parents had built? Or would they create something completely different? For a while, the family appeared incredibly close. Brad and Angelina traveled with their children. They attended premieres together. They were photographed walking through airports and exploring cities around the world. From their outside, it looked like a Hollywood family living an extraordinary life. But no photograph can show what happens inside a family. And in 2016, the public image of the Jolie Pitt family changed dramatically. Angelina filed for divorce from Brad Pitt. Suddenly, a family that had spent years appearing together was at the center of a very different kind of story. The headlines became more intense. The legal proceedings became complicated. And the children's names began appearing in coverage about their parents. This is where their story becomes particularly important. Because while adults could speak publicly, the children were still growing up. They had to navigate a family situation that was being discussed around the world. And unlike most children experiencing family change, their family life was being examined by millions of strangers. Every rumor had the potential to become a headline. Every photograph could become part of a larger narrative. And every stage of their childhood happened under an enormous public microscope. Yet they continued growing. Maddox became a young adult. Pax developed his interests in art. Zahara became involved in fashion and social causes. Shiloh began exploring her own interests and identity. Knox and Vivienne grew up away from much of the public spotlight. 6 children, 6 personalities, 6 different paths. And this may be the most interesting part of their story. Because despite being born into one of Hollywood's most famous families, they were never going to become 6 identical versions of Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie. They were becoming themselves. And as they entered their teenage years and eventually adulthood, the question began to change. The world no longer wanted to know only what Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie were doing. People wanted to know something else. Who were their children becoming when nobody was looking? And that question would become much more revealing as the 6 siblings began stepping into lives of their own. For the first part of their lives, the 6 Jolie Pitt children were known almost entirely because of their parents. They were Brad Pitt's children. They were Angelina Jolie's children. They were the children of one of Hollywood's most famous couples. But after 2016, That identity became much more complicated. The marriage was over. The family structure had changed. And suddenly, the children were growing up in the middle of a story that their entire world wanted to understand. For most families, divorce is deeply personal. For the Jolie Pitt family, it became public almost immediately. Headlines appeared everywhere. Commentators analyzed the relationship. Photographers followed the family. And the names of the children were repeatedly mentioned in stories about their parents. But the six siblings had something most people outside the family could never fully understand. They had each other. Maddox was the oldest. Then Pax. Then Zahara. Shiloh. And the twins, Knox and Vivienne. Their ages were different. Their personalities were different. Their interests were different. But they shared their experience of growing up inside the same extraordinary family. And that shared experience mattered. As the years passed, the children gradually began appearing less frequently in the spotlight. That seemed intentional. Angelina increasingly focused on giving the children privacy. She spoke publicly about motherhood and the importance of allowing her children to discover who they were, instead of presenting them as miniature celebrities. She often allowed them to remain relatively private. That was not always easy, because the public was fascinated by them. Every appearance generated headlines. Every new photograph created speculation. And even small changes in their lives could become entertainment news. But the children were growing beyond their identities the public had created for them. Maddox, for example, began moving toward adulthood. He studied at university in South Korea. That decision was significant. Instead of simply following his parents into Hollywood, he was exploring education and a life outside their American entertainment industry. He also became involved in filmmaking, including working alongside his mother on projects. This suggested something interesting. Hollywood was not necessarily something that children had to reject. They could choose their own relationship with it. Pax followed a different path. He developed an interest in visual art. He worked on projects connected to film and art. And again, the pattern became clear. The children were not simply copying their parents. They were experimenting with their own identities. Zahara also began stepping into public life in a different way. She became involved in college life and social causes. Her story was especially notable because she had the opportunity to use her visibility for something beyond celebrity. She became increasingly independent. And as she grew older, the public began seeing her less as Angelina Jolie's daughter, and more as Zahara. Then there was Shiloh. From childhood, she had attracted extraordinary public attention. But as she grew older, she increasingly developed her own interests. Dance became an important part of her life. Videos and reports about her dancing attracted attention online. But what mattered was not simply that people were watching. It was that she appeared to have found something she genuinely enjoyed. Something separate from acting. Separate from red carpets. Separate from her parents' careers. That distinction is important. Because when you grow up famous, choosing what you don't want to be can be just as important as choosing what you do want to become. Then came Knox and Vivienne. The twins spent much of their childhood away from the most intense public attention. But as they grew older, they too began developing interests of their own. Vivienne became involved in theater and worked with her mother on the Broadway production of The Outsiders. Knox, meanwhile, remained one of the more private members of the family. His public appearances were relatively limited. And perhaps that privacy tells us something. Not every child of a Hollywood superstar wants to become famous. Some may simply want to live. And that may be one of the greatest challenges facing children born into celebrity. The world assumes that fame is something they should want. But fame isn't always a gift. Sometimes, it's a responsibility you never asked for. Imagine being a child and knowing that millions of strangers already have an opinion about you before they've ever met you. Imagine going to school and knowing people recognize your last name. Imagine making an ordinary mistake and wondering whether someone might turn it into a headline. The Jolie Pitt children had to grow up with that reality. And yet, they increasingly seemed determined to create lives beyond it. This is also where the story of their parents becomes less important, because the children were reaching an age where they could no longer be defined entirely by Brad and Angelina. They were becoming adults, and adulthood brings a different kind of freedom. The freedom to decide where you live, what you study, who you spend time with, what career you pursue, and even what name you choose to use. For the Jolie Pitt children, that last issue became particularly significant. Over time, some of the children began publicly using names that did not always include Pitt. That development attracted enormous attention. But a name is deeply personal, and it can represent identity, family, independence, or simply personal preference. For the public, it became another chapter in the larger Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie story. For the children, it may simply have been part of becoming adults. And this is where we need two separate fact from speculation. The public can see photographs, public records, occasional statements, but we cannot know everything that happens inside a family. We cannot know every private conversation. We cannot know exactly what each child feels. And we shouldn't pretend that we can. What we can see is that 6 children who grew up under extraordinary scrutiny are gradually building lives of their own. And that may be the most important development of all. They are no longer simply the children of Brangelina. They are 6 individuals, 6 stories, 6 futures, and as they continue moving into adulthood, the biggest question may no longer be what happened to their famous parents. It may be what happens next to them. Because the children who once walked between Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie on red carpets are now beginning to walk their own paths. And some of those paths may lead them very far away from Hollywood. Others may bring them right back. Either way, for the first time in their lives, the choice is becoming theirs. For years, the world talked about the Jolie Pitt children as if they were one story. One famous family, one Hollywood dynasty, one complicated past. But that was never the reality. Because 6 children can grow up under the same roof and still become 6 completely different people. Maddox was the first. As the oldest, he experienced the transition from childhood to adulthood earlier than his siblings. He became interested in filmmaking and eventually studied abroad. That choice was revealing. He had access to Hollywood through his parents. He had opportunities most aspiring filmmakers could only dream about. Yet he also had the freedom to explore a world outside Hollywood. He was required to become another Brad Pitt. And he was required to become another Angelina Jolie. He could decide for himself. Then there was Pax. Pax developed an interest in art and creative work. His artistic side offered another glimpse into how differently the children were finding their identities. While their parents became famous through acting, the children could express themselves through other forms of creativity. Photography, art, film, fashion, performance. Their world didn't have to look exactly like the world their parents had created. And perhaps that is one of the most fascinating things about growing up with famous parents. You inherit an enormous platform, but you also inherit an enormous expectation. People expect you to use it. People expect you to become something impressive. People expect the next generation to live up to the previous one. But the Jolie Pitt children seemed to be moving in different directions. Zahara's journey was different again. She entered college and began developing a life increasingly separate from the Hollywood spotlight. Her involvement in social and community-oriented causes also reflected an important part of the family environment she grew up in. Angelina Jolie had spent years combining her career with humanitarian work. Her children were exposed to those experiences from a very young age. But exposure doesn't automatically determine identity. Zahara still had to decide what those experiences meant to her. And that is the difference between being influenced by your parents and becoming your parents. Then came Shiloh. Perhaps no member of the family attracted more speculation while growing up. From childhood, people were fascinated by her appearance, personality, and interests. But as she became older, another side of her emerged. Dance, movement, performance, discipline. She developed an interest that could exist completely outside her parents' careers. And that matters, because sometimes the clearest sign that a child is becoming independent isn't when they choose a completely different life. It's when they discover something that belongs only to them. Something they love because it makes them feel like themselves. For Shiloh, dance appeared to become one of those spaces. A place where she could express herself without needing to be Brad Pitt's daughter or Angelina Jolie's daughter. She could simply be Shiloh. And then there were the twins, Knox and Vivienne, born at the same time, but growing into very different individuals. Vivienne became involved in theater. She worked with her mother on the Broadway production of The Outsiders. And that experience was particularly interesting, because it brought her into the world her parents had known for decades. But on her own terms. She was simply appearing on a red carpet because she was the daughter of two movie stars. She was participating in a creative production, working behind the scenes, learning, experiencing theater, and discovering what that world actually felt like. Knox, meanwhile, has remained considerably more private. That privacy has made him one of the more mysterious members of the family. And perhaps that is exactly the point. Not every member of a famous family needs to become a public figure. Not every child needs to turn their childhood into a career. Sometimes, the most powerful choice is simply to remain private. 6 children, 6 personalities, 6 different approaches to fame. And perhaps the most interesting part is that none of them appears destined to simply reproduce their parents' careers. That doesn't mean Hollywood has disappeared from their lives. Far from it. Their parents' influence will always be part of their story. But influence is not destiny. Brad Pitt built a career around acting, filmmaking, and becoming one of the biggest movie stars of his generation. Angelina Jolie built a career around acting, directing, humanitarian work, and advocacy. Their children have grown up seeing both worlds, the entertainment industry, and the world beyond it. They have seen the rewards of fame. They have also seen its costs. They know what happens when a private family disagreement becomes international news. They know what it means to have strangers debate your family. And they know that a famous last name can open doors, while simultaneously putting a spotlight on everything you do. Perhaps that is why independence has become such an important theme in their lives. They don't need to prove that they can become famous. They were born famous. The challenge is something much harder. Finding out who they are when the famous surname is removed. Who is Maddox without Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie? Who is Pax? Who is Zahara? Who is Shiloh? Who are Knox and Vivienne? Those questions cannot be answered by photographs. They cannot be answered by celebrity magazines. And they certainly cannot be answered by internet speculation. Only time can answer them. And time is exactly what these children have been given. They are finally reaching the stage where their parents' identities don't have to dominate every decision. They can choose their education, their careers, their relationships, their interests, their homes, their friends, and eventually, their own families. That is the strange thing about celebrity children. When they are young, The public sees them as extensions of their parents. But adulthood changes their equation. Suddenly, the child becomes the author of their own story. And for the Jolie Pitt children, that transition is happening in front of their entire world. Some may stay close to the entertainment industry. Some may choose completely different careers. Some may become public figures. Others may disappear from public life entirely. We simply don't know yet. And perhaps we shouldn't, because after spending their entire childhood being watched, they deserve the freedom to decide how much of their adult lives the world gets to see. But there is one thing we can say with certainty. The story of the Jolie Pitt family is no longer just the story of Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. The children have grown up. The family has changed. And the next chapter belongs to them. But there is still one question hanging over the entire story. After years of headlines, separation, legal battles, and public scrutiny, what does the Jolie Pitt family actually look like now? And more importantly, what, if anything, remains between the children and the father whose name once defined the family? For years, the Jolie Pitt children were photographed beside both of their parents. Brad Pitt, Angelina Jolie, 6 children in between them. From their outside, it was the image of a modern Hollywood family. But after the separation in 2016, that image changed. And as the years passed, the distance between the former couple became impossible to separate from the story of their children. Their divorce was finally finalized in December 2024, after years of legal conflict. By July 2026, when Knox and Vivienne turned 18, all 6 children had reached legal adulthood. That milestone effectively brought the custody chapter of their parents' separation to an end. But ending a custody arrangement doesn't necessarily mean ending a complicated family history. And this is where we have to be careful. There is a tremendous amount of speculation surrounding Brad Pitt and his children. There are claims from sources close to one side. There are claims from sources close to the other. There are years of headlines. But the children themselves have generally not turned their private family experiences into a public campaign. That silence is important, because the public may want a simple answer. Who was right? Who was wrong? Who chose whom? But families are rarely that simple. And the 6 children are not characters in a Hollywood screenplay. They are real people who had to grow up inside circumstances they did not choose. What we can see, however, is that several of the children have made decisions about their identities as they entered adulthood. Shiloh legally changed her surname to remove Pitt in 2024. Zahara has publicly used the surname Jolie. Maddox has also begun the legal process to remove Pitt. And in July 2026, Vivienne became the 4th of the 6 children to petition to remove the name. That leaves Pax as the only child still publicly using the Jolie Pitt surname, according to recent reporting. To outsiders, a surname can look like a statement. It can look like a message. It can look like a rejection. But the legal filings describe the reasons as personal. And that distinction matters. We don't know everything that each child feels. We don't know every private conversation that took place inside the family. And we shouldn't turn assumptions into facts. What we do know is that these young adults are increasingly making choices about their identities for themselves. And that may be one of the most important themes in this entire story. For most of their childhood, the world chose their identity for them. They were the Jolie Pitt children. Now, they can choose who they want to be. That doesn't necessarily mean they have erased their father from their lives. It doesn't necessarily mean they have rejected everything connected to him. And it certainly doesn't tell us exactly what happens behind closed doors. But it does tell us something about adulthood. The power to define yourself eventually becomes your own. For Brad Pitt, this transition has also been painful. Recent reporting describes his relationship with some of his adult children as strained, while the precise level of contact remains unclear publicly. Pitt himself has recently spoken about a difficult period connected to family stuff and their emotional toll of that time. But perhaps the saddest part of the story isn't the headlines. It's the passage of time. Because when the Jolie Pitt children were young, there was always another birthday, another school year, another family photograph, another opportunity. Then suddenly, the children were adults. Maddox is now in his mid-20s. Pax is in his early 20s. Zahara is an adult. Shiloh is an adult. And Knox and Vivienne have just entered adulthood. The childhood years are gone, and you cannot go back and relive them. That's what makes this chapter so emotional. A parent can have millions of dollars, an extraordinary career, awards, fame, houses, success, but none of those things can buy back a childhood. None can reverse a family argument. None can erase years that have already passed. And none can guarantee that a child will remain close to you forever. That's true for ordinary families. But for Brad Pitt, the difference is that millions of people have watched his family story unfold. Every photograph has been analyzed. Every public appearance has been examined. Every surname has become a headline. Even silence becomes a story. And yet, there is another side to this. The children are not defined only by their relationship with their father. They have their own education, their own creative interests, their own friendships, their own ambitions, their own relationships with their mother, and their own relationships with each other. Angelina has recently spoken about how her children have encouraged her to rediscover parts of herself as they have grown older. She has described them as increasingly supportive of her moving into a new phase of life now that they are adults. That creates an interesting contrast. For years, the public story was about Brad and Angelina. Now, both parents are entering a stage where their children are no longer children. The family structure is changing again. Angelina has spoken about wanting to travel more and spend time outside Los Angeles. Brad continues his career in Hollywood. And the 6 children are moving into lives that increasingly belong to themselves. Perhaps this is the real ending of the Brangelina era. Not the divorce papers, not the court battles, not the headlines, but the moment when the children no longer need to be defined by their parents' relationship. They can choose what parts of their family history they want to carry, and what parts they want to leave behind. Some may maintain relationships with their father. Some may remain closer to their mother. Some may find a balance between both. And some details may never become public. That is their right. Because after growing up under one of the most powerful media spotlights in Hollywood, privacy itself can become a form of freedom. And perhaps that is the one thing the 6 children have been searching for all along. Not fame, not money, not another headline, just their ability to become adults without the world constantly telling them who they are. But there is still one final question. If the Jolie Pitt children are finally stepping out of the shadows of their famous parents, what will they become when the name Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie is no longer the most important thing about them? Because this story was never really about 6 celebrity children. It was about 6 human beings who grew up in the middle of Hollywood and are now finally getting the chance to write their own story. There is a moment in every family when children stop being children. It happens quietly. One day they are asking their parents for permission. And years later, they are making decisions their parents cannot make for them. For the Jolie Pitt family, that moment has arrived. All 6 children are now adults. And with adulthood comes something they have rarely had during their entire lives, their ability to define themselves. Maddox is now building a life connected to filmmaking and creative work. Pax has explored art. Zahara has pursued education and causes that matter to her. Shiloh has followed her own interests, including dance. Vivienne has explored theater. And Knox has increasingly attracted attention for his own interests while remaining relatively private. None of these paths guarantees fame. And perhaps that is the point. They don't need to become famous. They already grew up famous. What they need now is a life that belongs to them. That distinction may be the most important part of this entire story. Because when you are born into an extraordinary family, people often assume that your greatest challenge is becoming successful. But for the Jolie Pitt children, success may mean something completely different. It may mean having privacy, choosing your own friends, choosing where you live, choosing what career you want, and deciding which parts of your family's history you want to carry forward. Recent developments have made that transition impossible to ignore. Several of the children have taken steps to remove Pitt from the surnames they use or have legally sought to do so. Vivienne filed a petition shortly after turning 18, following similar moves by Zahara, Maddox, and Shiloh. The stated reason in the legal filings has been personal. Those decisions have generated enormous headlines. But a name is not a complete biography. It cannot tell us everything someone feels. It cannot explain every relationship. And it cannot tell us what happens privately between a parent and a child. What it does show is that these young adults are making choices about their identities. Choices that belong to them. And that may be the real ending of the Jolie Pitt childhood story. Not a dramatic Hollywood finale. Not a final photograph. But independence. The children who once had no control over the cameras surrounding them now have much more control over how much of their lives they share. They can choose whether to work in Hollywood. They can choose whether to appear on red carpets. They can choose whether to speak publicly. And perhaps most importantly, they can choose when to remain silent. That silence should not automatically be interpreted as anger. And it should not automatically be interpreted as reconciliation either. Sometimes silence simply means this is private. And after everything these children have experienced in the public eye, privacy may be one of the most valuable things they can have. Their parents' story will probably remain part of Hollywood history. Brad Pitt will always be Brad Pitt. Angelina Jolie will always be Angelina Jolie. Their marriage will continue to be discussed. Their divorce will continue to be analyzed. But their children don't have to spend the rest of their lives trapped inside that story. They can create another one. A story where Maddox is not simply Brad and Angelina's oldest son. Where Pax is not simply one of 6. Where Zahara is not simply Angelina's daughter. Where Shiloh is not simply a celebrity child. Where Knox and Vivienne are not simply the famous twins. They can become individuals. And perhaps that is the greatest thing their parents could ultimately give them. Not another red carpet. Not another headline. Not another $1 million photograph. But the freedom to become ordinary when they want to be. Because there is something almost ironic about growing up in one of the most extraordinary families in Hollywood. And eventually wanting something incredibly ordinary. A normal life. A private life. A life where your choices don't automatically become entertainment news. A life where a mistake can simply be a mistake. Where a career can be a career. Where a relationship can remain a relationship. Where your name belongs to you. That may be the future waiting for the Jolie Pitt children. Not necessarily a Hollywood dynasty. Not necessarily 6 new celebrities. But 6 separate lives. 6 separate identities. 6 different definitions of success. And perhaps, that is exactly what growing up was supposed to mean. Their childhood belonged partly to the public. Their adulthood doesn't have to. The cameras may continue following them. The headlines may continue appearing. People will continue asking questions. But the answers don't always have to come from the family. Sometimes the answer is simply watching what happens next. And there is one final truth that may be easy to overlook. The Jolie Pitt children did not choose to become part of one of Hollywood's biggest stories. They were born into it. They didn't choose the cameras. They didn't choose the headlines. They didn't choose the divorce. They didn't choose the years of public speculation. But now, they can choose what comes next. And maybe that is the most powerful ending this story could have. Not Brad Pitt's story. Not Angelina Jolie's story. Not even the story of Brangelina. But the story of 6 children who survived the weight of a famous family. And are finally becoming their own people. The world watched them grow up. Now, for the first time, they get to decide what the world sees.